好了，说到这里，大概是你们准备着吃药的，
Today
吃了，
is the seventh day of the teachings.
信息囊给给，加呗，肉松的学呗，嘎根卡给，那给你们那么听见的，
So I'd like to wish all of the Sangha members from the monasteries in India, Nepal, and Bhutan, the monasteries
这
and
边缺少嘛，
nunneries, as well as all the people in all of the Dharma centers
缺少嘛，
around the world, and everyone listening over the internet.
嘛，这是不是原因？
I would like to, first of all, offer you my greetings.
这里，嗯嗯。
So that's it. Basically, today is we're, we're speaking about the Upanishads. Right, so we're talking about these Upanishads to speak about them from the Buddha's perspective. We call them non-Buddhist extremist texts. So these Upanishads, now the other day I spoke about one portion of the philosophy in the Upanishads, and so and I would like to speak about the rest of them, the rest of that subject today.
When you
speak about the philosophy of the Upanishads, we spoke about the view of the nature of the world, and also and then also talk about the view of the. We could talk about the cause, the view of karma, cause, and effect. That's what I said the other day, but now I think it's actually better to say the position of what the ultimate aim of practice is. And so here in the question, we're speaking about the positions of the ultimate aim of practice. And so we're speaking about the ultimate aim of practice now. Now, the ultimate aim of practice, to speak about this, the Upanishads speak about the ultimate aim of our practice, or ultimately what we are seeking to get out of the practice in order to bring happiness. And so what we need to seek out then are two things. And of these two things, so they're basically two different causes. So the first of these is this. The ultimate end of our practice, either to remain here in samsara, in the way things appear, and to continue to remain within the way things appear of samsara, in samsara. And the second is to dissolve into the dharmata, or the essence, to enter this nature. And so what the first one is what we call samsara. The second is what is called liberation. And so there are two things that are waiting for us. So in the end, we are going to go to one or the other, either into samsara or into liberation. And in the Upanishads, when they distinguish between samsara and liberation, it's primarily distinguished by awareness and ignorance. Awareness is liberation, and ignorance is samsara. And so when you talk about the difference between ignorance and awareness, the difference is whether we are seeing or knowing the nature of the dharmata, or the basic essence. And so for that reason, we'd say awareness is the period when you have realized the way things are. This is called by the name liberation. And ignorance is the phase when we're deluded and ignorant, and this is called samsara. So when we talk about the word samsara, as I said the other day, spread very widely. The word became very common during the time when the Brahmanas appeared. Then by the time the Upanishads appear, the view had become stable. It became a very stable view, and later everyone else had great belief in it. And so it became that sort of a view or philosophy. In particular, during the time the Upanishads appeared, the presentation of karma also appeared at that same time. When I talk about karma or actions, because of the establishing the texts on karma or actions, when we speak about the presentation of samsara, the presentation of karma or action is very important and beneficial for the presentation of samsara. So it's a very important. The presentation of karma is a very important aspect and basis for the understanding of samsara. And the reason is because when we talk about samsara, the cause for returning in samsara is karma. And so therefore, there is naturally a great connection between samsara and karma. But at this point in time, when they're speaking about samsara, is different between what's spoken at that time and what we speak about in the Buddhist texts. The presentation of samsara in Buddhist presentation is a more expensive and more complete presentation of samsara. Now, at that time, the presentation of the world at the time of the Upanishads was a bit of a simpler understanding and not as complicated. So what it says in the Upanishads is that because of people's desires or attachment, they are born in samsara. And what that comes from is that the power of consciousness sets consciousness in motion. And because consciousness is set in motion, when we say setting consciousness in motion, we're basically moving our motivations. And because of moving our motivations, then we accumulate the actions or karma of body and speech. So it is the consciousness that determines what actions of body and mind we do. So that is determined by the consciousness that motivates it. And then because of accumulating actions of body and speech, then because of that, we have the ripening of karma. And so whether it is good or bad depends upon the good or bad actions that we have accumulated. And also, this lifetime is the result of actions in previous lifetimes, and the karma that we accumulate in this lifetime is the cause of future lifetimes. And so, in this way, there's a connection of one following upon the other between previous and past, the previous and past lives. And some places there's actually no gap in between past and future lives, and so you're continually cycling in samsara. And for this reason, it is called samsara, because samsara means to return, to cycle again. It's to cycle continue, and so for this time, the word samsara arose out of that. So first, we've talked about we cycle in samsara because of karma, and so the presentation of karma arose at that time, and so this is beneficial or it had an influence on describing how we cycle in samsara. if you don't have the presentation of karma, then you say we cycle in samsara. Then how do we have the if we have to have an explanation of why we cycle in samsara? It is difficult to explain. But because there is the presentation of karma, then it's because of the karma then it's easy to explain why we continually cycle in samsara. Now, the second point is to say that samsara is nature, suffering by nature. We need to be liberated from it. And we say that samsara is suffering is that during the phase of samsara, during the phase when we're staying in samsara, there is inexhaustible suffering. There's no end to suffering. We always say the ocean of suffering of samsara. There is just no end to the suffering of samsara. And so for this reason, samsara is something that we must be liberated from, something we must be liberated from. It is something we must eliminate. And so so samsara is an ocean of suffering. And we should, instead of trying to stay in samsara, we need to liberate ourselves from it. So for these reasons, there developed a view of having revulsion for the world. There's a way of thinking of having revulsion for a world. And so this is the time when it appeared in India. And the reason is because samsara, the world of samsara is suffering by nature, and we need to find ways to escape from it. And so what happens is we develop this view of they developed the view of the revulsion for the world. There are many different Upanishads, not just one or two, there are many of them, but among them, there's an Upanishad called the Brihadaranyaka. So among the Upanishads, there's one called the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And this is a particular Upanishad in which it describes that the Atman, or the self, the non-Buddhists assert that there is a self, right? They say that that self alone is immortal. The self alone is immortal, and everything else is by nature rising and perishing, and is by nature suffering. The self alone is immortal, and everything else has the nature of arising and perishing. And so at the time that the Upanishads appeared, the view of revulsion for the world gradually spread very widely. There is another Upanishad called the Maitrayaniya Upanishad. And what it says in this is, this world and our body are all completely suffering by nature. So this is similar to our Buddhist explanation of the external world being suffering and the internal sentient beings being the same. And it's very similar, and our aggregates of grasping are also suffering. And so this is a very similar explanation. In any case, there is an inextricable link between the view of samsara and the view of revulsion. The reason why there must be a view of revulsion is because there is the view of samsara. That is what led to the view of revulsion. And the reason it led to that is that samsara is suffering by nature. And if we need to liberate ourselves from it, then we need to see that samsara is not true or not properly. It is something we need to feel revulsion for, something we need to abandon. And so for that reason, there's this inextricable link between the view of samsara and the views of revulsion. But because of such reasons and evidence, if we or someone wishes to cross beyond the ocean of suffering, then there's one method. And what is that? That is to rest in equipoise and meditation on the ultimate nature. So this is and this is to resting the ultimate happiness, and that means liberation. Other than that, there is no other method you can choose. So next, I would like to speak about the assertions about liberation. Now, the Upanishads, if we ask what is the ultimate aim of the Upanishads, the ultimate aim of all of the Upanishads is to achieve liberation. This is clearly described. However, they know they need to achieve liberation, but how do you achieve liberation? They had many debates and investigations of this. So the main debates or discussion was regarding the methods to achieve liberation. They had different assertions about this, and so for this road, then they had many different debates and different expositions. There is no difference in their aim of achieving liberation, but there are quite a few different debates and positions about what the methods to achieving it were. And so when the question of liberation initially appeared, what people thought at first was that people thought there's not much point in achieving liberation because it's like a lazy view. It's like pointless. Why is that? Because at that time, the understanding they had of liberation was like, just being released from bonds or shackles, and then just being happy and enjoying whatever you enjoyed. And they thought that there's not a whole lot of point to that, they thought. But when you look at that liberation from a different perspective, there's actually a more profound understanding of that. Because that means liberation means that right now we are enveloped in the darkness of delusion. And it's like our whole entire head is like swaddled by the afflictions. We're deluded by the afflictions. It's like our head is swaddled by the afflictions and we cannot understand anything at all. So what is liberation? It means eliminating that darkness of ignorance and eliminating the afflictions that have swaddled our head, and then eliminate or freeing ourselves from the cage of confused appearance to rest in the Atman, and to rest in equipoise in the true nature, to be able to rest with one taste within the nature. So in the Upanishads, it is very clear that the ultimate aim of liberation is not going to another land where you've never been before. Instead, is actually discovering the nature that is within oneself, or it's a way of finding the method to rest within your own nature. So this is the method that they thought. Liberation for them does not mean going to a wonderful land where you've never been before. That's not how they understood it. Now, in order to achieve that liberation, what you need, in order to achieve liberation, we don't need to create some sort of special but conceivable and describable practice. Instead, what we have to do is we have to realize our nature, that is the Atma. And we need to recognize our own nature, the way our self is, or the nature of ourself, and that is Brahma. We need to recognize the Brahma that is inseparable from our own nature, and when we realize that that alone is enough to achieve liberation, we do not need to do anything else. Now, one thing we need to note at that time is that we talk about awareness. At that time, they said vidya. They talk about vidya. Vidya they are speaking about So we talk about when we talk sometimes, and we speak about awareness, and like awareness is in Tibetan is spoken as but like a synonym for intelligence. Here, awareness here has a special meaning. So it means awareness that transcends conception or words. It is inconceivable and ineffable. It is called Atma Vidya, the awareness of the self, or it is called Brahma Vidya, awareness of Brahma. It is the awareness that recognizes the way things are. That is the sort of awareness that is intended. It is not the what we often think about of awareness in terms of learning or knowing ordinary worldly things. Now, another thing is that we need to remember that at that time they performed a lot of offering and sacrificial rituals. They also had sick standing and good worldly behavior, so giving up killing and giving up stealing and so forth. And so it's understood that these are virtue, but they are a mere virtue, but they are unable to free us from samsara. Practicing them does not free us from samsara, they say. Nor can they bring us to achieve liberation, they say. So what they say is that we absolutely must rest in meditation on the nature, and by doing this, we can achieve liberation. Merely practicing virtue of body, speech, and mind does not help us achieve liberation. We need to rest in the actual nature of things, the way things actually are. And so what it says about this in the Upanishads is, it says, I bow to Brahma, and also says Brahma Vidya, and so forth. And the awareness of Brahma or about Brahma. And so these are speaking about are not our worldly understanding of awareness or bowing as worldly people would ordinarily understand. Instead, it is saying that we must overcome the appearances of subject on object, or the perceiver and perceived, it is asserted. So that is how they described it. But if we wish to reach this level of the view where we can overcome the appearances of subject and object, or the dualistic appearances of perceive and perceived, then we might have followed the steps of practice. We have to train both our body and our mind. And since we need to give training to both our body and our mind, thus in the Upanishads, it teaches that the Upanishads teach that we must not disregard the behavior of an upstanding worldly person practicing virtue or performing the usual offerings and sacrifices and so forth. And it's because these are important virtues, so we must not disregard them. And so the Upanishads speak about many virtues of body and speech that we need to engage in. For example, it speaks about these. There's one called tapas. Tapas means basically austerity or ascetic practices. It's dana, which is generosity. And there's ajarva, which is like being straightforward and sincere. And ahimsa, or nonviolence. In addition, it speaks about speaking truthfully and so forth. And so it speaks about the five yogas of the five behaviors of yoga. These are said to be very important for achieving liberation. Later, the Upanishads added the practice of nyasa. And so what nyasa is, it can sort of is a type of meditation where you're kind of like where you're blessing the different parts of your body. And this is also an important aspect, an important element for achieving liberation. And if you have this element, then you will not be attached to anything in the world. And if you're not attached to anything, the afflictions that obscure will then naturally be pacified. And so along with this practice of nyasa, you also have to practice dhyana. Dhyana means meditative concentration, and then yoga. So you have to this dhyana and yoga. You have to the practice of dhyana and yoga. And see these each complement each other. They're very beneficial to each other. So you need to practice all of them. In particular, they would often combine yoga and dhyana and yoga together, and they'd call it dhyana yoga. And what this says is that you need to combine the bodies, the powers of body and mind together. Yoga means like the hatha yoga we practice, and dhyana means the meditation. So when you combine the two, then you're combining the powers of body, speech, and mind in order to distance yourself from distractions and to be able to rest, settle in meditation within. So this is probably around the middle of the period when the Upanishads were appearing. They'd already appeared. And so at that time, they began to this great interest in the practice of dhyana. Basically, you have to practice all of these practices that I've just mentioned. In order to practice them, you would have to go to unpopulated forests or riverbanks or caves to do the practice. And when doing that, you'd have to sit up straight and then control the inflation explanation of the breath and meditate on the syllable Om, which is a symbol of Brahma. You meditate on this letter Om that symbolizes of Brahma. And then all the appearances would become kind of indistinct. All the coarse appearance would kind of like become indistinct and sort of start to dissolve. And if you can rest within that, you would get closer and closer to Brahma, or the self. And as you go through these stages of the practice, then eventually what happens is that the afflictions and stains would then become thinner and thinner. And then the vidya, the vorta vidya awareness would be opened. All the actions or karma accumulated in previous lives and so forth would gradually be purified. And as well and also all the results of that would ripen in future lives would also be extinguished. In the end, what would happen is that ignorance would be completely eradicated, and due to that, you would achieve the state of liberation, and they teach. So that is basically about the practice during the time of the Upanishads. Now, when to talk about the Upanishads, there are quite a few of them. There are many different Upanishads texts that are called the Upanishads. But among the ancient ones, then I said there are probably a couple dozen or so. Now, all of these Upanishads are basically texts that examine the philosophy of the Vedas. And since they're all philosophical texts, they're all and so they all record the assertions of the various wise people and of different traditions and of different time of that time. So thus the Upanishads, they have many different conflicting or even contradictory ideas about philosophy. And this is because they're recording the assertions and traditions of different scholars. And so what happens, and of course, sometimes they conflict with each other. And so this is, I think, the reason why by the end of the period when the Upanishads were appearing, there were many different philosophical schools that were spreading. This is because there are so many different philosophical viewpoints within the Upanishads that there also developed many different philosophical schools. So later, during the age of philosophy, the reason why there are so many different philosophical schools is primarily was in order to eliminate or resolve the different contradictions and disagreements within the philosophy taught in the Upanishads. I think that it's probably okay to state this.
다 디젤야
So, so now we have the Vedas, the text of the Vedas, the text of the Brahmanas, and the Upanishads. Now, if we compare them and see what are the different areas where they developed, and what are the different the distinctions in the time, the period in which they developed, in terms of the places where they appeared, the places of their origin, the Vedas originated primarily in Punjab, in the northwest of India. When the Aryan peoples arrived in Punjab, they developed the Vedas appeared, right? I mentioned the other day. So among these, this is primarily thinking about the Rig Veda is probably in Punjab. Now, the place where among the Vedas, there's the Atharva Veda that originated in the area around Varanasi. So now the Upanishads are from various different areas, from both the south and the north of India. And then there are the two great epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The Mahabharata originated in central India, and the Ramayana probably also originated in central India. Now, within the Vedas and the Brahmanas and the Upanishads, the biggest distinction is the way they think of the gods, the different ideas of what the gods are. Well, if we want to explain it simply, in the Vedas, the gods were viewed as being something external. If you look outside and see something external to yourself, and they had forms, they're physical. And so you made offerings to these physical gods. Now, and as far as what the internal or actual God was, something that they kind of thought a little bit, but they never really actually examined what it was. Now, when the Brahmanas appeared, we think about the gods that are external to us. Those gods with physical forms are something we use, but the actual God is something else. And that is the actual, what we actually make the offerings to that actual God. During the time that the Upanishads appeared, the external forms of the gods are not the actual gods. And so it's like you disregard all those external gods. Instead, you think about the internal God, the actual God, or Brahma. And that is what you need to make offerings to. This is the actual thing that you need to make offerings to, the internal God, the God that is the nature of how things are. And so there's a big difference in how the gods are identified. But if you say that the Vedas and the Brahmanas and the Upanishads are completely different, that wouldn't be right. And because the reason is because the Brahmanas primarily propagate the philosophy, the rituals in the Vedas, and the Upanishads investigate with the philosophy taught in the Brahmanas according with intellectual logic. And so between these three different types of literature, there are also great connections. But if we were to think about when they appeared chronologically, then this is difficult to say. Sometimes at the end of a Veda, there is a word from an ancient from an early Upanishad. Sometimes from the end of a Upanishad, there is a word. There's a quotation for Brahmana. So the way the Indian people thought was that what appeared in an earlier age, for example, the literature that appeared in an early age, how do I say this? If something appeared in an earlier age, it doesn't necessarily have to be earlier than something that appeared later. This is the way they thought of it. And so for this reason, some of the hymns in the Vedas appeared in the age of the Brahmanas. Actually, of course, it's a Vedic hymn, but the time that appeared was during the Brahmanic period. And some Brahmanical texts appeared during the time of the Upanishads. So to put it in the same time, the times when the Vedas and the Brahmanas and the Upanishads appeared were not sequential, one after the other. During the time of the Vedas, there are also Brahmanas appeared, so they're all around the same time. So it's impossible to say which was earlier and which was later. And we look at the Brahmanas and the Upanishads. Generally, the Brahmanas appeared earlier and the Upanishads later. We do say it. We have to say that, but we can't actually say that. Because at the time that the Brahman is appearing, there are also quotations from the Upanishads, so they must have been contemporaneous. So you cannot say that they were sequential. And so it's difficult to separate them into earlier or later chronologically. So, but generally, we speak about them in terms of the Vedic period and the Brahmanical period and the period of the Upanishads. And the reason why we say this is during each of these periods, primarily, there was one that's like in the leading position. The one that had like the type of literature that had the primary importance, the primary effect. For example, during the Vedic period, it was the Vedas that were primary. During the Brahmana period, it was primarily the Brahmanas. And during the Upanishad period, those were the primary ones. And so because it's like this, during the periods of during each of these periods, you have to look at what was most important or what had the primary or leading position. That is how they're directed. It is not that they're directed, it is otherwise. It is difficult to explain them in a chronological order. So now I'd like to speak about the two great epics. So I will give an introduction to the two great epics. Now, during the late Vedic period, not only during this period were there the Brahmanas and the Upanishads, there are also the two great epics, and this is described in Dinda's Mira on Poetry. And so these are called the epics with many different texts with many different chapters. And so these are called the great epics in our texts on poetry. And so the two great epics, and so these are the two great epics here are the most influential works in Indian literary history. To speak about them in terms of literary terms, they're like some of the most important jewels of world literature. And in terms of historical research, they're like important and indispensable texts. And so what these two epics are, one is the Mahabharata, and the other is the Ramayana. And so many people think of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. People know a bit about them. I think most of you know something about them. because in India and Nepal, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana is very well known. And so I think you know a fair amount about them. So I haven't prepared to say much about their content. So I'm not going to say much, but I will give a brief introduction to them. But first, I will speak about the Mahabharata. Now, the entire Mahabharata is 74,000 stanzas long. So 74,000 stanzas. In terms of the number of words, there are 1,800,000 words. So this epic is the third longest epic in world literature. So it's incredible. So if it's that long a text, what is it that's the first and second place, you wonder? The first place is what? Is our Tibetan epics of Lingesar. The first place is Lingesar epics. There's no longer than that. That's the longest. This is the longest epic poem in the world, and that's the epic of Lingesar. No, I don't need to say too much about Lingesar. Now, the second is, the one is from the Kyrgyz people in the country of Kazakhstan, which is called the Epic of Manas. And this Epic of Manas is the second place. And so the third place is the Mahabharata in terms of length, in terms of the longest epic structure. So how long is the Mahabharata? If I explain it this way, I think you'll understand it better. If one person to recite it from beginning to end without taking any breaks, it would take 2 weeks to recite the entire text. It would take 2 weeks. If you recite for 2 weeks, only then will you finish reciting the Mahabharata. So that's how long it is, this epic. And at the time when the epic was recorded in writing, if we to make an estimate, it's probably from around the 3rd century BCE till about the 5th century, the Common Era. So it's probably from the 3rd, the 2nd, and the 1st century BCE, and then the 1st, 2nd, and the Common Era, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. So probably around over 800 years. So it took about over 800 years to write the entire epic down. And since it took 800 years, we can understand so so it is unnecessary to say that instead of only having one author, it must have had multiple authors. Now, when the Mahabharata first appeared, it was only recited orally. It was preserved in an oral tradition and only recorded in writing later. Now, what is said in India is that the first author of this text was a sage named Vyasa. And now another name would be translated as born in the dark land, but the most well-known name is Vyasa, the sage Vyasa. And so the sage Vyasa wrote it down, and so Vyasa wrote it orally, and so it was written down by Ganesha. This is the god with the elephant head, right? So the Indian god Ganesha was the scribe who wrote it down, and it was dictated to him by the sage Vyasa. And so the text is so long, it's such a big text that It's such a long text. And he was writing, as he was writing it down, he was writing it probably through some magical power that the gods' pen probably just wore out. It didn't have any power left. And so he had no other way to do it. And so he had no other thing to do. Ganesha he has an elephant head too. So elephants have tusks, right? So he pulled out his right tusk and used it as a pen to write it down. And so for that reason, among all the gods of India, if you look at it, Ganesh has no right tusk. If there's one, if they draw Ganesh with a right tusk, then they don't actually know how to write him. It's because he had no pen, and so it had nothing else to do. So he just pulled out his tusk, and he pulled out the tusk and used it as a pen. Now, one important thing about the Mahabharata is that it's like one important thing is that one of the extremely texts in the Indian literature is kind of like the Christian Bible called the Bhagavad Gita. So it's the Bhagavad Gita, and that is in the Mahabharata. So it is one portion of the Mahabharata text. Now the Gita, or the Bhagavad Gita, became like one of the root texts or fundamental texts of Hinduism. Now the Tibetan scholar Jonan Taranata translated some passages of it into Tibetan, but I don't know whether they have been preserved until this point. In the 20th century, Genu Chupel translated its name into Tibetan as the Palingdanapu, the song of the great black Bhagavan. But they haven't the entire Mahabharata has not been translated. If someone can recite it, it takes 2 weeks to recite it. Then you can tell from that how long it's going to take to translate it. So translating it into Tibetan, it would be very difficult. So the entire text has not been translated into Tibetan. But there are a few works that are related to it. And one of the most well-known among them, during the time of the 9th Panchen, there was someone who had the position of Zasa named Laman Yeshitsutra. He was a great scholar in poem. And he wrote a story called the Story of Pandu's 5 Sons. And this is a very well-known text. And that story was extracted from the Mahabharata. And this is probably the most well-known literary work in Tibetan that's related to the Mahabharata. Now, also another thing that is said in the Mahabharata is that after the 5 Pandavas had won the war, the eldest son, his name is Yudhishthira, and so he governed the kingdom, and he ruled the kingdom. But in the past, they had a war between relatives, and so he felt very despondent over this and felt a lot of revulsion for this, and he gave up his kingdom and then went to the Himalayas. And then they say eventually that he went to the realm of the gods, they said. So in the end, where did they say that? Where were the places of the gods? It was what we call the snow mountains. It was probably Mount Kailash in Tibet. So it must have been in Mount Kailash in Tibet. So this is where the gods lived. When they speak about the land of the gods, it is they probably mean Tibet, as some scholars say. Likewise, some Tibetan histories say that the first king of Tibet, Nyatri Tsempo, was this character Yudhishthira. And there is something to think about here. Now, if the first Tibetan king, Nyatri Tsempo, was Yudhishthira, it's difficult to say that for certain, but there is a saying that it is so. So now I'd like to speak quickly about the Ramayana. Now, the other great epic is the Ramayana. This is basically the story of the king Rama. Now, this epic is 24,000 stanzas long. So basically, it's like a quarter of the length of the Mahabharata. So if you divide the Mahabharata into quarters, this would be the length of a quarter of it. Now, its author is said to be the Maharishi Valmiki. And the time that it was recorded and written was from around 300 BC to about 280 or in the Common Era. So it took about that long to write the entire text. Now, you also probably know there's a really famous Chinese text called The Tales of Travels to the West. Later, and this is made into movies, right? So this is what we call the Treupakpa, the noble monkey. So in there's the character, the monkey Sun Wukong. So Sun Wukong, if we translate it into Tibetan, it probably means the monkey who realized emptiness. And so where his origin is from Hanuman. They took Hanuman as the basis for creating the character Sun Wukong. And so that's how it is. Okay. So I think it's probably fine to leave it there. And when we reconvene, I will continue.
다 마하바라트 안에디 가르사데 라마야는 도지 대니버디 아니 편순 충돌을 제외입니다.
Now, if we wanted to compare the Mahabharata and the Ramayana together, or with each other, the Mahabharata tells the story of a violent war that occurred in the 13th century BCE. And the area where this war happened was primarily in the regions around the area of Delhi. And it primarily speaks about the history of the Moon clan. So it's relating stories from a very ancient time. And the Ramayana pitch, it probably speaks about events that occurred in around the 11th century BCE. And it primarily speaks about the clan, the Sun dynasty, or the clan of the sun from the land of Ayodhya. So these two epics discuss the two great and powerful kingdoms in the eastern and the western parts of central India at that time. Now, in particular, we think about the Ramayana. So if we wonder whether there's the Ramayana in Tibetan or not, they discovered a translation into Tibetan of the Ramayana in the Dunhuang caves. And it was translated in around the 9th century. So this is a very old translation. Likewise, in the 15th century, there was a student of Lord Tsongkhapa named Shangshengchong Drapa, who wrote a long poem related to the Ramayana. So this is called a very well-known verse epic based on the Ramayana. Later, the 20th century Gendun Shippo made a synopsis of the Ramayana and wrote it, but he didn't complete it. So it's completed by his student, or Rakta Chetong. And so we can see this text as well. But for a complete translation into Tibetan, there's probably not a complete translation into Tibetan. But from what I understand, as someone in Tibet has translated the Ramayana from Chinese into Tibetan from Chinese, and it takes about 7 or 8 books, but I have not received a copy of it, so I cannot say much about it. So that's about all I have to say in terms of an introduction to the 2 epics. Now, if I have an opportunity in the future, I, of course, can say more. So next, what I would like to speak about is in the epics there's discussion of the kings of the Sun Dynasty, or the Sun Clan, and the Moon Dynasty, or Moon Clan. So I'd like to now speak about the Sun and Moon clans. Now, these dynasties of the Sun and God Moon clans, so these are basically dynasties or royal descendants of royal lines. Now, in India, there are texts called the Puranas, which were written later. Now, these are probably can be called histories or texts on ancient events. And what it writes in these it gives all the oral traditions, the stories about the ancient kings of the Sun Clan and the Moon Clan, and records them in writing in these texts called the Puranas. Now, in the Mahabharata, so there are two sons, one named Dhritarashtra and Pandu. And their sons and their descendants so the question, now there's a dispute between them about who should take over the kingship, and there was a war between the 2 of them. And also there was the line of kings of Kosala, who was in the line of the Sun Clan. Now, the other day we mentioned Manus, who's like the ancestor of all humans. So you could say it was his son or his grandson. In any case, there was a king Ikshvaku. And so the Ramayana tells about the story of the war within his descendants. So in the Puranas, these histories of ancient times, and so that when the Bharatas and the Panchalas, so when these Bharatas and the Panchalas fought their war, they'd come to the 93rd member of the Saurya dynasty, of the royal lineage of the kings. And in the Moon Clan, there had been 45 kings in the land in the line of the royal line. Now, the reason I need to speak about these 2 lineages, the Moon lineage and the Sun lineage, is that in our Buddhist texts, the Buddha Shakyamuni is said to be in the royal lineage of the Sun Clan. And so for that reason, one name the Buddha is called by is the friend of the sun. Now, this is not in Tibetan but there, in Chinese, there is a text by Nagarjuna. Of course, there's some debate about whether it was written by Nagarjuna. It's disputed, but there is a text, a great commentary on the 100,000 lines Prajnaparamita Sutra. And there's a text in there here of the Buddha said to be the friend of the sun or the clan of the sun, the Surya Vamsha. So Surya, the Surya is this. Some people say the Surya Vamsha. So the word is in Surya Vamsha. I said it's pronounced it incorrectly before. So Surya Vamsha is a synonym for the friend of the sun. Now in the Rig Vedas, the name of the sun god is Surya. And so the members of the Surya Vamsha, the sun family, are the descendants of the son of the god. And so the Buddha was born in this sun clan, in this royal line of the sun, and that reason why it's called the friend of the sun in the Buddhist scriptures. And this topic comes in there's a little bit about this in the original texts of Buddhism, or the old texts of Buddhism. In Pali, there is a text called the
Sutra Nipata.
There is a text in the Pali canon called the Sutta Nipata, called basically it means the short text, the short sutra. And there's also the Pabhaja Sutta, the sutra on going forth. And so in these two sutras, they discuss how the Buddha is in this royal line that descended from the sun. Because after after Gautama had gone forth, and he traveled from his homeland of Kapilavastu, and so and on the way from Shravasti to Shravasti, he met the king of Magadha, Bimbisara. So he met King Bimbisara on the way, and when he met him, then what the Buddha said is, so this is basically my ancestry is the sun, and my clan is the Shakya. O king, I do not have any desire of desires and have gone forth from that home. So what he's saying there is that, and so he's saying what his ancestry is, what his clan is. He's pointing that out. And so his ancestry is the ancestry of the suns, the clan or the caste of the sun. And as a clan is the Shakya clan. And so this is said in an ancient Buddhist text. And so his familial clan's name is the Shakya. And his ancestry, because he's called the friend of the sun, his ancestry is included in the Sun clan. So as I said before, this ancestry from the Sun clan comes from the king Ikshvaku. So it's Ikshvaku, and so this is in Tibetan. This is like the one of the sugar cane field. The cane is very sweet that you eat, right? So he's in the lineage of that royal line, descended from Ikshvaku, and the Buddha was born in that royal line. Now, the kings of the sun lineage, most of their names, they're primarily farmers, and since they were farmers, their names are all related to the fields and the crops that they planted in the areas around their kingdoms. Likewise, the Shakyans were also farmers. So later, some scholars said
With
all the names of the kings of the Sun dynasty or the Sun lineage were related to fields and agriculture. This shows that they come from a people of farmers. This shows that the Shakya Celtics are from a lineage of farmers. So actually, the Shakya clan was probably not a Kshatriya class. It was probably probably actually in a farming class. Actually, I think the Shakya clan is a little bit different. It's actually in a small. It was not a major kingdom. It was a minor kingdom, and their society is one where they actually worship the gods. Now, the Aryan peoples didn't really have didn't worship goddesses much before. Now, the indigenous Indian people before the Aryan arrival did worship goddess. Likewise, the Shakyans also worship the sun. So this is the society. And so for this reason, the Japanese scholar Miyasaka Yushu hypothesizes that so the Buddha was from the descent of the Sun clan, or the royal line from the sun. And he was born in a society where they worshipped worshipped goddesses. And in addition to that, and later, when the Mahayana secret mantra had spread after the origination of Buddha Shakyamuni was known as Vairocana. So Vairocana actually is a synonym for the sun. And so the reason why it was called Vairocana, or the sun, is probably for this reason, they say. So in the Mahayana, and in particular in the secret mantra, the Buddha is called Vairocana. And say that he's the essence of Vairocana, or a form of Vairocana. And the reason for that is because of the background shown in this history. So this is his hypothesis. So here, to elaborate on the issue of the speaking about the Mahabharata and Mahabharata and Ramayana, I've spoken about the clans of the sons and the kings, and therefore the royal lines of these, and speaks about that the Buddha was a member of the Sun clan, and so it gives the reason why the Buddha was called the friend of the sun, and so forth. And so that is why I gave that introduction. So next, I'd like to speak about a little bit more about caste. Now, the reason before this is I was speaking about the caste or the clan as it being the Buddha, and the Buddha being in the Sun caste or the Sun clan. So I'm going to talk about the caste in India. So I think it's good to give an introduction to caste in ancient India. Now, it's well said, it's generally accepted that the Buddha is in the Kshatriya class. Now, of course, there's some that say he's not in the Kshatriya class, but in the Vaishya class. Now, I spoke a little bit about the topic of caste briefly, but I thought if I spoke about it a bit more in detail, it'd be good. And the reason for this is that, for the one thing, caste is very important in India. And the reason for this is that caste provides the basic framework of Indian society and the basis of the professions, because whatever job you're going to go, it goes on the basis of caste. So for that reason, if we do not understand caste, then it's difficult for us to understand the situations in Indian society. To look at it from another angle, if we can understand the topic of caste and the importance, the situation of caste and the customs and the societal framework, then we can understand why the Buddha's teachings had so much greater influence and were so more meaningful and spread so widely. And so we can only understand that if we understand caste. And so for that reason, I will now speak about caste. Now, how did to give the historical background for how castes developed? As I said the other day, in terms of its geography or whatever angle you look at it, for a period of over 1,000 years, it basically had no contact with any other country. One reason is that it was surrounded on three sides by ocean, and in the past they didn't have the maritime technology. They didn't have good enough ships, since they weren't able to travel there by sea. And so when it and then the other sides are all surrounded by mountains. And so mountains are, of course, difficult to cross. And so basically, geographically, had very little contact or very few ways to make contact with other countries. So basically, for about 1,000 years, India had very little contact with other societies. And this is a situation that is actually relatively rare in world history. Now, this situation both had advantages and disadvantages. You can explain it in terms of its advantages and in terms of its disadvantage. So to speak about it from a positive angle, the weather in India is good, the land is fertile. And so they could spend many years living there without much danger from external enemies and live in relative peace. And so for that reason, they were able to develop and sustain this really great Indian civilization. And because people had a good livelihood and they were living in relative peace, and only in that situation could the civilization really develop. And they had time to think about philosophy and so forth. If you don't have any food to eat, and you have difficulties living, forget about philosophy. Forget about civilization. The first thing, you're not even able to fill your own stomach. And so in order for civilization and philosophy to develop, the fundamental thing that you need is that you need to have peace in the society. When there's peace in society, then people can relax. And then they are able to think about philosophy and so forth. So this shows that at the time, the basic livelihood in Indian society was good, and that they had plenty of provisions. And so this shows that it's a good, fertile ground for developing philosophical views. After we think about the negatives, though, as the society gradually developed, they developed traditions. So many different complications, and they had many different complicated things that occurred. And as this happened, and they were used actually to limit the freedoms of the populace and to suppress the power of the people. They suppressed the rights and the freedoms of peoples. And so if we think about it, to understand the word caste, we first need to understand the word in Sanskrit. In Sanskrit, caste is called varna. Now, the original meaning of the word varna, now, of course, later the meaning changed. It was explained differently, but originally it meant color. It's like talking about white and red colors, right? So we're talking about color. Now, the reason that is that at that time, the light-skinned Arya peoples came to encounter the dark-skinned indigenous people of India. Because the colors of their skins were different, They started to distinguish people based on the color of their skin. And so that became the caste. So I'm Aryan, they're not Aryan. How do you know? It's by the color of the skin. One is light, one is dark. And so they made the distinction based on the color of the skin and therefore used this word. And so who used this word? Is it the Aryan people use this word? The indigenous people didn't say, I'm dark-skinned. The people says dark-skinned seems worse. They don't say that. So the people who are light-skinned later, the ones who are victorious, the light-skinned peoples who are victorious, used this as a name for the dark-skinned people. So to put it very simply, the word caste, or the word varna, at the very beginning, was first used as a way to distinguish the Aryan and the non-Aryan people. So later, there are many different explanations and so forth, but there wasn't much of that meaning at that time. However, later, some of the 21st century academics at that point talk about the distinction between the color. So it's not a question of the skin color. It is not a question of light or dark skin. The way we should understand it, they say, is that we divide the world into two, the light world and the dark world. So talking about a color difference of the world. We Aryan peoples are from the white worlds, the light worlds, the better parts. And the indigenous people, the ones who were indigenous to India, they were there from the dark world. So it's like they were barbarians who lived in darkness, and the Aryans were the light-skinned people. And so this is another explanation that some scholars give. So now we've spoken about the Aryans again, so now we have no choice but to speak a little bit more about the Aryan peoples. Now, the reason we need to say about the Aryan people is that so if we say, as I said the other day, where did the Aryans come from? They are peoples who came from Central Asia. Now, when they came to India, it wasn't a huge group of people all arriving at the same time. So they came as an individual's tribe coming over. Each group came, and they came over the course of several hundred centuries. It wasn't like tens or hundreds of thousands of people all arrived at the same time. So for that reason, when each of the tribes of the Aryans came, they aren't a single ethnic group. There are many different ethnic groups that all came in separate groups. Like for these days, when we Tibetans speak about, we call all Westerners foreigners. We give them the single name foreigners or Westerners, but actually within there are many different peoples, whether the Europeans, the Americans. And the African peoples and so forth, they're all described, but we call them all foreigners because they come from abroad. We call them, they're not from our people, so they come from outside our country. And so for that reason, we call them all foreigners. But actually, are foreign people just one ethnic group? They're not. There's no single group that's foreigners. Even within foreigners, there are many different ethnic groups. And similarly, within the Aryans is like an overall name. But even within the Aryans, there are many different peoples. So the Aryans were made up of many different ethnic groups and tribes, and altogether they are called the Aryan. So the Aryans are not a single people, a single ethnic group. They're not a single ethnic group. So now if we want to see, well, whose group are they included in? Well, the scholars have a lot to say about this, but we won't speak about them now. In any case, when we speak about caste in India and we talk about an ethnic group, these are two actually very, very different. When we talk about the ethnic groups and we talk about the castes of the four distinctions of the four castes, they're very different, and we need to understand this. It's important not to misunderstand this. And the reason is that the Aryans are not a single ethnic group. Likewise, the Brahmanas and the Kshatriyas, were not divided into different castes based on their ethnicity. So how is it they are divided into castes? How are the distinctions of caste made? Well, it's as I explained the other day. And so when during the later Vedic period, the Aryan peoples all had, the different people had different occupations, and so on. Based on these occupations, the three castes, the castes were developed. And so how are people? So how is it that people were divided based on their professions? Well, those who did the offerings and sacrifices were the Brahmins. The kings and the soldiers were called the Kshatriya. And those who did the productive jobs were all called the Vaishya. Now, they're all Aryan peoples, and then there are the non-Aryan peoples, and they were called the Shudras. They were given the name Shudras. And so they were then basically regarded as inferior for their entire lives. So that is what happened. They were regarded as inferior. So generally, we have spoken about how from the time that the Vedas first appeared, there was like unending conflict between the Aryas. The Aryans just came in, and the people in India, there are constant conflicts between the Aryans and the non-Aryan peoples because one came from outside, and when they arrived, there was a lot of conflict in between the two, and so there was a lot of war and conflict. And it's not necessary to speak about that now. And so at the very end, what happened is the Aryan people became very strong in India. And so gradually the distinctions in caste began. But when the distinctions in when the caste system first developed, there first were the names of the castes, the Brahmins and Kshatriya and the Vaishya classes. But at that point, the caste system and the rules of the caste system were not yet clearly defined. So when was that distinction made clearly? It was at the end of the Vedic period. As the Vedic period drew to a close, the distinctions in the castes grew sharper and sharper. Now, so to give an introduction to the class, now the Brahmins come first. The Brahmin Leps came. And so the Brahmin came first, so I'll speak about him. And so what are the Brahmas? What is the Brahmin caste? These are the priests, the people who did all the rituals. And because they're the one who did the rituals, so at the beginning, there weren't special people doing the rituals. Everyone was doing the rituals. But later, there are people particularly who are performing the rituals. And these the priests who did the rituals taught their son how to do the rituals, who taught their son. And out of this lineage passing down from father to son, they developed the Brahma caste. Likewise, at the end of the Vedic period, so during the later Vedic period, and earlier the rituals were very easy, and later they got more and more elaborate, more and more complicated. And in particular, during the later Vedic period, there were also several very powerful kingdoms. And so what happened is that the kings became very wealthy. And so they only did very elaborate rituals. And not just one or two elaborate rituals, but they continually performed the elaborate rituals. So, for example, like one king would do like a month-long ritual, and then another king would do a month-long ritual. So there were always continually elaborate rituals, and so you needed to have people who could do this. The reason is because you didn't have people who knew how to do it, because the rituals became so elaborate. And so who knew how to do it? It was the priests who knew how to do it. The priests who performed the rituals, they understood how to do this. And so for that reason, they gradually became very important. and they became more important than regular people and also became superior to other people. And as it came to a superior position to other people, and then other people looked at them and saw, oh, they're different from everyone else. I think there's really something about them. People would recognize them like that. And people would also say, those, we don't know how to do these complicated rituals, so let's give them all of them the responsibility for doing all the rituals. And so that feeling also developed at the time too. And so in addition to that sort of situation, in addition to that, the Brahmas would say various different things. They'd say kind of a little bit of true. They could tell stories, myths, stories that might have been true or might have not been true. The stories that the Brahmas came out of the forehead of Brahma and so forth. And they'd write this down and say that basically the Brahmas are just really incredible. And they write the stories and give some explanations of this. And when they did this, then everyone started to think that the Brahma caste was so important and sacred. And as that gradually happened, what happened is that the Brahmas had all of the authority for religion in their hands. Because at that time, what you had to do, if you wanted to practice religion, what you had to do was do a ritual. And because it was the Brahmins who did it, so for that reason, they took all the responsibility or the power of religion. Likewise, who made the connections between humans and gods? It was the Brahmas, because they're the ones who did the rituals, and the rituals are a way to make a connection between gods and humans. And who does that? It was the Brahmins who performed the rituals. And so like the phone or the connection between humans and gods, who held it? Not everyone had the phone. It was in the Brahma's hands. It was like the Brahmins had the phone for calling the gods, and if you didn't respect it, no one else could use it. And so like the Brahmins became like living gods. In our Tibet, there's like we've talked about the lamas and chulkas as being like living Buddhas. Now, what do they say in India? They say living gods. And so who is that? That's the Brahmins. And so the reason why this is said is that in the Brahmanas, there's one called the Shatapatas. There's a text called the Shatapata Brahmana. It says that there are two types of gods. And those ones are the gods who are representatives of us. Those are the actual gods. And then there are gods to whom you give offerings. And those are the human gods. The people to whom you're generous are the human gods. There's also a text called the Manusmriti. This is a very well-known text. And what it says in this, whether they educate or not, the Brahmins are great gods. Whether a Brahmin has an education or not, they're great gods. So you can't kind of criticize them for not being educated because they're great gods. So they considered Brahmins as being like gods. Fraxon is saying that the Brahmins are really good and they're really working hard to make it and they're really lifting themselves. But from an actual, if you think about it the way things actually are, if you want to become an actual Brahmin who has all the characteristics of Brahmin, it's not so easy. In order to become a Brahmin who people would be able to be invited to perform rituals, you have to have many different qualities. The first of them is you have to have a good voice because you have to recite the text. If you're going to recite the Vedas, then you have to have a good voice, like our chant masters, the Umzes. Now, the second thing is that you have to have a good complexion, a good figure. Someone who, when you look at him, looks good. And like someone who's kind of bent and crooked. Now, the third thing you need is not someone young. If someone's too young, think there's someone who's too young, they don't know what they're doing, they don't have experience. You need someone who's come to a certain age. Now, the third thing you need is someone who's got an education. And then the fifth is someone who's got kind of stable in their behavior, not someone who's kind of frantic and hectic. And also the last is that someone who is just does the virtuous conduct. So you have to have a lot of these qualities. And so it's not easy to be a Brahmin. So the Brahmins, they had to follow many rules. They had to, so many things they did. They had a lot of work that they had to do. They had a lot of responsibilities. So becoming a Brahmana was not actually very easy. Now, how did the name Brahma come? So the name came from Brahma. So in the beginning, we're talking about Brahma, is, as I said the other day, I mentioned the other day, how the 4 different priests to perform rituals. The Rig Veda divides the priests who perform rituals into 4 groups, and the last group is called the Brahmins. And so because of the name Brahman, then the Brahmin caste came from that. However, later, people gave all sorts of different explanations of this, and so people then said that Brahma is the god Brahma, right? And so it said the son of Brahma. It says a son of Brahma, is what they said. If you say Brahma is a son of Brahma, and they give him a very high explanation. At the beginning, it wasn't said; they weren't said to be sons of Brahmas, but as the Brahmas got more and more important, and when they explained it, then they said they're the god, the son of a god, the son of Brahma, a living god, and they explained it in many different ways. And okay, come on, let's bring on the kings. Now I'll speak about the Kshatriyas. Now in Tibetan, we talk about we say the royal caste, but actually in the Indian languages, they call it Kshatriya. They say the Kshatriya caste. And the Kshatriya doesn't mean only the king. It also includes the kings and the ministers and the soldiers and so forth. Basically, the kings and the ministers. Now, the reason why there had to be a Kshatriya caste was because of their different responsibilities and different occupations. In the early Vedic period, there wasn't really any particular Kshatriya caste. But there were kings at that time. But when people would say kings, but it's really just like, it's just like the leader of a particular tribe, the chief of a tribe, the person who protected a clan or a tribe. It wasn't like a big, powerful king like they later became. But later, as the Aryans moved from the Punjab down to the area, the Ganges River Valley, and their population grew much larger. And the areas grew much larger and larger. And so as the power of the chieftains grew larger and larger, so as the area grew larger, the power grew better. They had more people to look after, and so they had more and more power. And so, in comparing to regular people that a higher status or higher rank. So this is the beginning of the Kshatriya caste. Now, the word Kshatriya caste. Now, the word Kshatriya comes from the word that means power. So basically, it means someone who has the political power. And the reason why this is said, though, is that because these are the people who had the power, because the Kshatriya class was primarily the kings and the soldiers. And so they exercise the political power, and they're the ones who engaged in military activities. And so because of this, they had great power. So for this reason, they also had the right to study the Vedas and so forth. Now, the third type of caste is the Vaishya caste. So now let's bring on the Vaishya caste. So it said that Vaishya means basically the common people, the farmers who did agricultural work. Oh, I need to bring them on. Okay, here he is. So this is the farmer. And then he also had the craftspeople who made various trades, and then also the people who engaged in commerce or in trading. So basically the people who did all the productive trades. And so where the word comes from, it comes from the root vish, which means people or subjects or common. So basically it means the same as what we say for common people today. So it's understood as meaning the ordinary people. Now, yesterday I spoke about the Shudras, and these are like the serfs or the slaves. Their response was to be the servant to the other three castes, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas. So basically they were the servants. They're also called the Ekachati, the single birth ones, because later they gradually their rights grew less and less, and so they had no right to practice religion. And because of this, they're called the single birth. They only had the opportunity to take a human birth. They didn't have the right to do religious work, so they're called single birth. The other three castes had the right of achieving a human birth, and in addition, they had the right to practice the religion. So they're born into two lives. One is they're born into the human life. They're born into the religious, so they're born twice. But the Shudras were only born once, and they had the human life, and not just any human life, but a bad human life, where they're always servants to the other people. Now, if we speak about how the distinctions in the castes came about, it's actually very, very simple. Because of the division of labor into different professions, then the castes arose from that. So many later texts describe the origins of the caste system in very different ways. There are many, they mix it with the various different legends and myths about how the distinction in caste arise. And so it became unclear, later it became unclear how the caste distinctions actually arose. The actual origin was covered over by so many different legends and stories. It's difficult to distinguish them. But if you look at the ancient text, it's actually unclear how the distinctions arise. But if you do include some distincts, and some it's clear and some it's not. For example, there's a text called the Vayu Purana. That's because this is one of the oral histories. There are many of these Purana texts or history texts, and what it says is that at first there is no distinction in caste. But later the Brahmins, or the god Brahma, divided people in different professions and made caste distinctions. So we can hypothesize from this is that at the beginning there was no caste distinction, but the caste distinctions arise later. Likewise, in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, there is the myth about how the four castes rose from the Brahma's body, the Brahmins from Brahma's forehead, and the Kshatriya from his right shoulder, and so forth. Now, the way this is said is actually giving an example of it. Now, looking at the analogy itself is not looking about actually what it's saying. It does in actuality talk about how the castes arose. Now, within the ranks of the class distinctions, there are always continual conflicts between the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. As I mentioned the other day, there are the seven sages, right? The famous ancient sages. And among them, there are two who are the most famous. One was called Vishvamitra, and one is called Vashishta. And so there's a lot of disagreements between these two sages. There are many debates or conflicts between the two. And what this shows is that the reason why they had such debates is that one was a Brahmin and one was a Kshatriya. And because of this, there are divisions. That's one way of explaining it. Now, not everyone says this, but some people do explain it in this way. So the reason why the debates arose between the Kshatriyas and the Brahmins is because the Brahmins had put themselves in the highest position, in the supreme position. That's what they thought. But the Kshatriyas had great power, and so because they're struggling for power. And so for that reason, there were many disputes. So now I'm going to give a summary of the Brahmanic period. It's better to talk about the summary of the Brahmanic period. So now I'm going to give the summary of the Brahmanic period. We need to wrap it all up, right? So the summary is basically this.
잠시
So if we talk about the Brahmanic period or the later Vedic period, this became like the time that formed the basis or the essence of Brahmanic civilization. And there had been great development in India and the cities. There were cities, and there were royal palaces, and many very elaborate houses. And people generally had good feelings towards their kings, and the agriculture improved. And at that time, the people paid taxes to the kings. And there were also judges who oversaw the laws and justice, and also the people like government workers, such as the, except for the police. And people generally respected the laws and the police. But the way they dispensed justice was really backwards. It looked like very barbaric, actually. The way they decided things was to determine of whether you were guilty or not. How did they examine this? They'd break some piece of burning metal, they'd put some iron in a hot, and they'd make it sort of red hot iron, and they'd make you touch it with your hand. And if your hand was burned, then you're guilty, and they'd punish you. If your hand wasn't burned, then they'd let you go. So basically, whether someone is guilty or not, when they touch the iron, so say whether if his hand if it didn't burn, then that's their lucky day. And if their hand burnt, then they were punished, no matter whether they're guilty or innocent. And particularly in the royal palaces at that time, the palaces are very important places because, like, they're hubs for education. They were like schools. And the reason is because at that time, all the learned people in the area would gather in the royal palaces and hold discussions. And there are the priests, the royal priests. And there are the Brahmas, who are the Purohitas, the Brahmas, who are the royal priests, whom the king had great faith in. These had to be people who had to have great education, and so they also had did a lot of work to increase people's knowledge and education. Sometimes also the kings would hold large conferences, and they'd invite many different scholars from many different areas of India. They'd have these great conferences, and the topics of the conferences are like about rituals, about consciousness, like how does it go to the next lifetime, and so forth. Then we talk about a god. What is the nature of a god? What is the god? What is the nature of the world? And they would investigate this and debate this. And it wasn't just in the palaces. The priests who did the sacrifices also had their own individual schools, and even sometime within their own household would give education also. Similarly, there are also some scholars, some Brahmins, who would go into the forests to live in solitude. In any case, most of the Brahmins of that period always had students around them. Because they had the students, then of course they would be inspired and get some sort of a new view, or get some sort of a new sometimes they'd be inspired to get a new view or a new understanding, new experience, and they'd teach it to their students, who would then record it in writing. And so for this reason, people of later eras are able to understand the experience and the realization of views of the people of that period. So basically, in terms of comparison with the early period, the Brahmanic period was where there was much more education. And in terms of households and the society, the distinctions in labor and responsibility were much more clearly defined. Because the distinction of caste was so clear, people could really clearly know what job one was responsible to do. And so for that reason, the civilization improved greatly. It was a very good situation in the society. Likewise, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, no matter what level they were, if they were young, they all had the right to receive an education. And the women also had very good rights at that time. For example, the women also were able to, if the father died, the women were able to inherit the household finances. Likewise, women were allowed to participate in rituals. And when there were conferences and meetings and so forth in public, then women had the right to speak. And whether think about the teachers who gave education, or the political workers, the government workers, there are also many images of women. That is, there are many women who could be seen to do these societies. So the relation between the genders, the women did not have the same level of freedom as they do in current Western societies, but they did have a certain degree of freedom and independence. And it wasn't such a conservative, repressive society where you weren't allowed to do anything and everything was prohibited. It was a rather looser society. So, of course, there were the distinctions between the four castes, but if you compare it to later times when the various different philosophies appeared, there were the distinctions between the four castes, but there were not so much disregarding or viewing other castes as being inferior or superior. So later it got worse and worse and worse as the time went on, and became more and more confining and got very difficult. And like also women's position also got worse and worse over time, and became a very difficult, bad situation. But at that time, it was really pretty good. And so that's how it is. And so that is what I have to teach for today. So now we'll recite the dedication prayers.